She woke up in her torn wedding dress, chained like an animal to a dirty wagon. 3 days ago, Elizabeth was on her way to marry a wealthy banker. Now, she was being hauled across the desert to be sold to the highest bidder. But when a lone cowboy appeared on the horizon, guns blazing, everything changed. What happened next would force her to choose between the safe life everyone planned for her and the wild, dangerous freedom she never knew she craved. This story will remind you that sometimes the worst day of your life can become the doorway to the life you were always meant to live. It's about breaking free, not just from chains, but from the invisible prisons of other people's expectations. Elizabeth's journey teaches us that true freedom isn't about safety or comfort. It's about having the courage to choose your own path, even when it terrifies you. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me, have you ever had to break free from someone else's plan for your life? And if you want more stories about strong women finding their power, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. As the evening settled, she woke up to a world of hurt and confusion. Her wedding dress, which should have been a beautiful symbol of her future, was torn to shreds around her aching body. She was bound by iron chains to the back of an old rickety wagon. What should have been a joyful ride to her wedding had become a dusty, desperate journey under a blazing western sun. A gruff voice yelled from the driver's seat, "Keep moving! We'll get ourselves a mighty fine price for a pretty bride like you across the territory line." Elizabeth pulled on the chains again, feeling the cold metal dig deep into her wrists. How did everything go so wrong? Just 3 days earlier, she was preparing to marry Harold Williamson, a banker's son. Her father had arranged the marriage before he passed on, hoping to secure her future, but it seems fate had a different path for her. A pack of outlaws had hit the coach that was taking her to the church. They took care of her escort and snatched her up, likely to sell her off like livestock at some remote outpost. The wagon slammed into a deep rut, making Elizabeth bite her own tongue hard. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth, but she swallowed her tears right down. She was not about to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The leader of the gang, a man they called Silas with a nasty scar from his left eye down to his mouth, reined his horse in beside the wagon. "Almost sundown, boys. We'll make camp up on that ridge," he said, nodding toward some rocks up ahead. His cold eyes landed on Elizabeth, and a wicked grin stretched across his face. "Don't you worry now, little bride. Just a few more days, and you'll have a brand new husband. He might not be what you were picturing, but beggars can't be choosers." The other men let out a laugh that sent a shiver straight down Elizabeth's spine. There were 5 of them altogether, hard-looking men with empty eyes and hands that were always ready, hovering near their pistols. As the wagon started to slow, Elizabeth saw a plume of dust rising in the distance behind them. At first, she figured it was just a dust devil, a common sight out here in the Colorado Territory back in 1875. But this dust cloud was moving with a real purpose, following their exact trail. One of the men called out, "Silas, we got a rider coming up fast." The leader squinted, looking into the setting sun. "Looks like just one." Silas spit onto the dry ground. "One man ain't no threat to us. Probably just some rancher heading on home." But Elizabeth kept watching as the cloud of dust got closer and closer. A little spark of hope, the first she had felt in days, started to flicker inside her chest. The outline of a lone rider on a horse became clear, moving with a steady, determined speed. "He ain't slowing down," another outlaw said with a warning in his voice, his hand going to his gun. The lone rider came over a small hill, and Elizabeth could see him plain as day now. He was tall and broad in the shoulders, sitting atop a powerful chestnut-colored horse. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but the way he carried himself spoke of a quiet, dangerous confidence. "Stop right there!" Silas yelled as the rider got closer, pulling out his revolver. "This business ain't yours, stranger." The rider slowed his horse to a walk, keeping his hands in plain sight, far from his own holstered guns. "Just passing through," a deep, calm voice said. "Though I have to wonder why you've got a bride chained up in your wagon." Elizabeth's heart was hammering in her chest as the stranger's eyes met hers for just a second. They were as blue as a mountain lake and just as deep. In that brief moment, something passed between them, a silent promise that seemed to change the very air. "She's our property fair and square," Silas shot back. "Found her abandoned on the trail. We're just taking her somewhere safe. Is that right?" The stranger's eyes never left Elizabeth. "Ma'am, is that how you see it?" Before she could even answer, Silas fired a warning shot that sent dirt flying near the stranger's horse. I said, "Move on." What happened next was a blur, so fast Elizabeth could barely track it. The stranger's hand moved like lightning, his revolver appearing out of nowhere. Two shots cracked through the air, one hitting Silas's gun hand and the other catching the outlaw beside him in the shoulder. The other outlaws scrambled to find cover as the stranger urged his horse forward, shooting with incredible accuracy. One man tumbled from his saddle and another caught a bullet in the leg. The wagon driver jumped down and took off, vanishing into the brush as bullets zipped right past him. In just a few moments, only Silas and one other man were left on their feet, both of them wounded. "The next one goes right between your eyes, Silas," the stranger said with a chilling calm. "Drop your weapons and back away from the lady." Cursing, Silas and his last man standing tossed his guns into the dust. "This ain't finished," Silas snarled. "Well, it is for today." The stranger swung down from his horse, his pistol still aimed square at the outlaws while he walked toward the wagon. Now that he was closer, Elizabeth got a good look at him. His skin was tanned like old leather from the sun. His jaw was firm and covered in dark stubble, and his eyes were a startling blue that seemed to look right into her soul. He wasn't a boy, maybe 30 years old or so, with crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both good times and hard roads. "Ma'am, the name's Ethan Keller," he said, his voice softening as he looked at the chains on her wrists. "Let's get you out of these things." "Elizabeth Prescott," she answered, her voice all scratchy from thirst. "I am grateful to you, Mr. Keller." Ethan holstered his pistol and pulled a small metal pick from his vest. "Now hold real still." His hands were rough with calluses, but they were surprisingly steady as he worked on the lock. Every time his fingers brushed her skin, Elizabeth felt a peculiar warmth spread up her arm, even with all the fear and weariness she felt. "Where were they hauling you?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the lock. "I have no idea," Elizabeth confessed. "They stopped my coach 3 days ago. I was traveling to my wedding." Ethan's gaze flickered up to meet hers for just a second. "Your husband must be worried something fierce." "He wasn't my husband yet," she corrected him. "And to be honest, I barely know the man. His name is Harold. It was a match arranged by my father." With one last turn, the lock clicked open and the heavy chains clattered away from her wrists. Elizabeth let out a breath she did not know she was holding, rubbing her chafed skin. Ethan turned his attention to the outlaws, who were glaring at him with pure hatred. "You two can start walking. If I ever lay eyes on you again, I won't be in such a giving mood." "You're a dead man, Keller," the one named Silas threatened, holding his bleeding hand. "Could be," Ethan allowed with a hard smile. "But today ain't the day." As the two figures stumbled away, Ethan looked back at Elizabeth. "You think you can stand?" She nodded, but when she made to get up, her legs, cramped and weak from being still for so long, just gave out from under her. Ethan caught her right before she hit the ground, his strong arms wrapping around her. "Easy now," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair. Elizabeth felt him lift her up, holding her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all. Being this close to a stranger should have scared her, but instead she felt safer than she had in days. "My ranch is about 4 miles east of here," Ethan told her, carrying her over to his horse. "It is not much, but we have food, water, and a safe place for you to rest." "What about them?" Elizabeth asked, glancing back at the retreating outlaws. "They'll be too busy trying to survive out here on foot to cause us any more trouble for now." Ethan helped her get onto his stallion and then swung up into the saddle behind her. "Hold on tight." Elizabeth leaned back against him, too worn out to think about what was proper. As they rode away from the wagon, she could feel the steady rhythm of Ethan's heart against her back, a strong and comforting beat. The sun was dipping below the horizon as they reached the top of a hill, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Down below them was a small valley with a simple ranch house, a barn, and a few corrals. A little wisp of smoke was curling up from the chimney, a promise of warmth and safety. "Welcome to the Lazy K," Ethan said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "It is not much, but it's home." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elizabeth let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right after all. As they got closer to the ranch, a young man came out of the barn holding a rifle. "It's me, Jesse," Ethan called out. "You can put that rifle down." The young man, who looked no older than 18 and had a mess of sandy-colored hair, lowered his weapon. "Mr. Keller was not expecting you back, so—" His voice faded as he laid eyes on Elizabeth. "Who is this?" "This is Miss Elizabeth Prescott," Ethan answered, getting off his horse and reaching up to help Elizabeth down. "She has had a rough couple of days. Miss Prescott, this here is Jesse Cooper, my ranch hand." Jesse took off his hat, showing a friendly, boyish face. "Ma'am," he said with respect, "you look like you have been through heck, begging your pardon." "Jesse," Ethan said in a warning tone. "No offense meant, ma'am," Jesse said quickly. Elizabeth actually managed a small, weak smile. "None taken, Mr. Cooper. And you are not wrong." Ethan tossed Jesse the reins. "Take care of Samson, will you? And then go fetch Doc Peterson. Tell him it is urgent, but not a matter of life or death." "Yes, sir." Jesse led the horse away, stealing curious looks back at Elizabeth. Without another word, Ethan swept Elizabeth up into his arms again. "Let's get you inside. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, will help you get cleaned up." The ranch house was simple but clean and well kept, with practical furniture that was built to last, not to impress. A kind-faced, gray-haired woman looked up from her cooking stove as they came in, her eyes going wide when she saw Elizabeth's condition, her torn and filthy wedding dress. "Oh, my sweet Lord," the woman cried out. "Martha, what on earth happened here?" "This is Miss Elizabeth Prescott," Ethan explained, helping Elizabeth into a sturdy wooden chair. "She was taken by Silas Turner and his bunch. I sent Jesse to fetch the doctor." Martha Winters wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and rushed to her side. "You poor, poor thing. First things first, we'll get you a hot bath and some clean clothes. Mr. Keller, would you mind putting another kettle on to boil?" The next hour was a warm, soapy haze for Elizabeth. Behind a screen in the kitchen, Martha helped her soak in a big copper tub, washing away the grit and terror of the past few days. The older woman tutted with sympathy as she saw the dark bruises and scratches that covered Elizabeth's pale skin. "Those animals," Martha grumbled. "It's a lucky thing Mr. Keller came along when he did." Elizabeth winced as Martha gently cleaned a nasty cut on her arm. "How did he even know where to look for me?" Martha just shook her head. "He didn't. Mr. Keller was just on his way home after selling a few horses up in Denver. I reckon it was just Providence smiling on you." Dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe that Martha pulled from an old trunk, belonging to her daughter before she got married and lit out for California, Elizabeth found herself sitting at the kitchen table. Ethan was setting a plate of food down in front of her. "It's nothing fancy, just stew," he said, almost apologetically. "Martha's the best cook around, but we keep things simple out here." "It smells heavenly," Elizabeth told him, realizing just then how bone-deep hungry she was. She lifted a spoonful to her lips and nearly sighed with relief at the rich, savory taste. "This might be the most delicious thing I have ever eaten." A faint smile touched the edge of Ethan's mouth. "Being hungry is the best spice there is." While she ate, Elizabeth watched him from under her lashes. In the warm glow of the lantern, she saw he had a rugged sort of handsomeness, with lines on his face that came from the sun and the wind, not from his years. His hands, which handled the heavy coffee pot with an unexpected gentleness, were covered in the calluses and faint scars of a man who worked hard for a living. There was a quiet strength about him, a solidness that made the whole room feel safer. "You mentioned you were on the way to your wedding," Ethan said, taking a seat across from her with his own cup of coffee. "I suppose your fiancé will be out looking for you." Elizabeth put her spoon down. "I can't say. Harold and our marriage was arranged by my father before he passed away last winter. I've only met the man twice. He's the son of a banker in Denver." "And where do you hail from originally, Miss Prescott?" "Boston. My father brought us out west after my mother passed, hoping he'd strike it rich in the mines. He left me with plenty, but on the condition that I marry Harold. He said it was to make sure my future was secure." Ethan's face gave nothing away. "And now?" Elizabeth looked down at her hands, the skin still red and angry from the chains. "Now, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't have any family left, and A sharp knock on the front door cut her off. "That'll be Doc Peterson," Ethan said, standing up. "Let's have him take a look at those wrists, Doctor." Peterson was an older gentleman with kind eyes and hands that knew their business. He carefully checked Elizabeth's wrists and the other scrapes and bruises she'd gotten during her ordeal. "You're a very lucky young woman," he declared, smoothing a soothing salve over her raw skin. "No bones are broken, and these cuts will heal up just fine as long as they're kept clean. The main things you need right now are plenty of rest and good food." He turned to Ethan. "She shouldn't be traveling for at least a week, maybe longer." "She's welcome to stay as long as she needs to," Ethan answered right away. "Martha can see to her." "That I can," Martha confirmed. "The poor girl needs some looking after, what with all she's been through." After the doctor headed out, Elizabeth had to fight to keep her eyelids from closing. The rush of the day, along with a belly full of warm stew, was making it nearly impossible to stay awake. "You ought to get some sleep," Ethan said, seeing her struggle. "You can have my room. I'll bunk with Jessie in the spare." "Oh, I couldn't possibly," Elizabeth started to say. "It's already decided," Martha cut in. "You need a real bed and a good long rest. Now you come with me." She was too worn out to put up a fight, so Elizabeth let Martha guide her to Ethan's room. It was a simple room with a solid bed made of pine, a chest of drawers, and a small desk for writing. Through the window, she could see the corral where a few horses were grazing peacefully under the moonlight. "You sleep well now, dear," Martha whispered, turning the lamp down low. "You're safe here." As the door clicked shut, Elizabeth sank down onto the mattress. The room smelled faintly of pine and leather, a scent she was already starting to connect with Ethan Keller. For all the strangeness of where she was, an unexpected feeling of calm washed over her as she drifted off to sleep. Elizabeth woke up to bright sunlight pouring through the window and the far-off sound of horses nickering. For a second, she was confused by the unfamiliar room, and her body tensed, ready for a fight. Then yesterday's events came flooding back to her. She was safe. The cowboy, Ethan Keller, had saved her. A gentle knock came from the door. "Miss Prescott, are you stirring in there?" It was Martha's voice. "Yes, please, come in." Martha came in holding a stack of folded clothes. "I brought you some things to put on. They were my daughter's, but she left them here when she went out west. They might be a little big on you, but they'll do for now, until we can figure something better." Elizabeth gratefully took the plain cotton dress and underthings. "You are so very kind, Mrs. Winters." "It's Martha, please," the older woman said firmly. "And it's not kindness to help somebody who's in trouble. It's just what decent folks are supposed to do." She helped Elizabeth get dressed, using a few pins to make the big clothes fit a little better. "Mr. Keller rode into town first thing this morning. He's sending out telegrams to the lawmen about those bandits, and to let your fiancé know you've been found safe." Elizabeth felt a knot tighten in her stomach when she heard Harold's name. In the middle of all the chaos, she hadn't given much thought to her intended husband or what he must be going through. "There now," Martha said, stepping back to look at her work. "You look a whole lot better. Come on and get some breakfast. After that, you can sit out on the porch for a spell if you'd like. It's a mighty fine day." The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon sizzling in a pan. Jesse was already at the table, and he shot to his feet as soon as Elizabeth walked in. "Morning, Miss Prescott," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "You're looking a sight better, if you don't mind me saying." "Thank you, Jessie," Elizabeth said, and she took the chair that Martha pointed to. During breakfast, Jessie talked to Bluestreak about the ranch, how Ethan had built it up from scratch after he came back from the war, how they raised some of the best horses in the whole territory, and how everyone knew Ethan for being fair and having a steady nerve. "Mr. Keller's the best boss a man could ever hope for," Jessie said with real feeling. "He took me in after my pa passed on, gave me a job, and a roof over my head. Everything I know about ranching, he taught me." "He seems to be a good man," Elizabeth said, and she was surprised by how much she wanted to know more about the man who saved her. Jessie nodded his head hard. "The best. He mostly keeps to himself, though. Been hurt too many times, is my guess." "Jessie Cooper, that is quite enough of your talk," Martha scolded, but her voice was gentle. "Miss Prescott doesn't need to be hearing all of Mr. Keller's private business." After they finished eating, just like she promised, Martha got Elizabeth settled on the porch with a quilt over her lap and a cool glass of lemonade. From her rocking chair, she could see a good part of the ranch. The corral where some fine-looking horses were grazing, the big barn where Jessie was now busy with his chores, and beyond that the rolling hills and wide open sky that looked like it went on forever. It was a world away from Boston, with its crowded streets and stuffy rules. Even Denver, where she'd lived for a short time with her father before he died, had felt small and closed in compared to this vast open land, freedom. For the very first time, Elizabeth started to wonder if her daddy's grand plan for her was really about her happiness, or just what he figured was best from his own corner of the world. The sound of horse hooves pulling closer snapped her out of her thoughts. Ethan came riding into view, his tall frame a dark shape against the bright morning sun. Something inside Elizabeth jumped a little when she saw him, a feeling that was both confusing and downright thrilling. He swung down from his horse smooth as you please, patting the animal's neck before handing the reins off to Jessie, who had just stepped out from the barn. Their talk was too far off for Elizabeth to make out the words, but she saw Jessie nod his head a few times before he led the horse on away. When Ethan turned back to the house and spotted her there on the porch, he took off his hat and started walking her way. It struck her again how his presence just seemed to take up all the air around him, even though he moved with a quiet confidence instead of any loud show. "Miss Prescott," he said, "coming up the porch steps. You're looking a sight better today." "All thanks to your kindness, Mr. Keller," she answered him. "Martha mentioned you rode into town to send some telegrams." Ethan gave a nod, settling into the chair next to hers. "I let the sheriff know about Turner and his bunch. Also sent a wire to Denver, to a Mr. Harold Williamson." "I figured that must be your intended." "Yes," Elizabeth said back, a strange, empty feeling in her voice. "What did you tell him?" "Just that you were safe and sound, recovering from your troubles out here at my ranch, and that you'd be heading back to Denver soon as you were fit to travel." Ethan watched her face for a moment. "I hope that was the right thing to say." Elizabeth stared out at the mountains way off in the distance. "I suppose it was. It is what everyone expects." A quiet moment passed between them before Ethan spoke up again. "You don't sound too eager to get back to that fella, if you don't mind me saying so." "I hardly know the man," Elizabeth admitted. "We have probably spent a grand total of 3 hours together and always with a chaperone. Our marriage was my father's idea, not mine. And what is it that you wish for, Miss Prescott?" The question hit her like a surprise summer storm. Nobody had ever asked her that. Not her daddy, not Harold, not a single one of the high society ladies who took such an interest in her future after her father passed on. I do not know," she said, and it was the honest truth. "I have never really had the chance to figure that out for myself." Ethan's blue eyes met hers for a long second, and something passed between them. Maybe it was a feeling of knowing they were alike in some way she could not quite name yet. "Well," he said after a bit, "you've got some time to think on it while you're getting your strength back here. The doctor said you'd need at least a week, you remember?" Elizabeth nodded her head, feeling a strange sense of relief at the reminder of her ordered rest. "Thank you again for your hospitality, Mr. Keller." Ethan, he corrected her with a little smile. If you're going to be staying under my roof, we might as well be on a first-name basis. Ethan, she said back, liking the way the name felt coming out of her mouth. And you must call me Elizabeth. The days that came after settled into a nice, easy rhythm. Elizabeth got stronger with every sunrise, helped along by Martha's good home cooking and the clean mountain air. She'd spend her mornings out on the porch, sometimes with a book from Ethan's small collection. Other times, she'd just sit and watch the ranch life happen right in front of her. In the afternoons, when the summer sun was beating down its hardest, she'd rest inside. Once she was feeling more like herself, Martha found little chores for her to help with, like shelling peas, kneading up bread dough, or mending a shirt. Elizabeth was surprised to find she liked doing those simple things, especially in Martha's cozy kitchen with its perfect view of the mountains. Come evening after supper, they would usually all sit out on the porch while the day cooled off. Jesse would sometimes pull out his harmonica, and the sweet, sad notes would just hang in the twilight air. Martha would be knitting or mending by the light of a lamp while Ethan smoked his pipe, the rich tobacco smell mixing with the evening breeze. It was during these quiet evenings that Elizabeth started to learn more about the man who had saved her. Ethan did not talk much about himself, but from Jesse's stories and a few things Martha let slip, she pieced together a picture. He was a man who had fought for the Union in the war, came home to find his family's farm in Missouri burned to the ground, and so he headed west to make a new start. He had built this whole ranch with his own 2 hands, beginning with nothing but a couple of horses and a dream. The horses, they saved him, Martha told Elizabeth one afternoon while they were hanging laundry out in the yard. After the war, he was a different man. Haunted, you could say. But working with those animals, well, that brought him back to himself. Elizabeth's eyes wandered over to where Ethan was standing in the corral, working with a young bay stallion. There was something captivating about seeing him with the horses. His movements were slow and sure, and his voice was a low rumble that could settle down the wildest of spirits. "He has a real gift," she said out loud. Martha nodded. "That he does. He understands them creatures better than most folks understand each other." On the 4th day she was there, a reply came to the telegram Ethan had sent. Harold Williamson wrote that he was relieved she was safe, and that he would come to fetch her as soon as his business allowed, which would likely be in about 2 weeks. Elizabeth read the short message 2 times over, looking for any sign of deeper feeling, worry about what she had been through, joy that she had survived, maybe even a little love. But the words were just cold and businesslike. She folded the paper up real careful and tucked it in her pocket, not quite sure why she felt let down when she had never looked for any grand romance from Harold to begin with. That evening, she found Ethan by himself out on the porch. Jesse had gone off to visit some friends in town, and Martha had already turned in for the night. He was standing at the railing, just looking up at the stars, which were blazing up there with a brightness Elizabeth had never seen back in the city. "Do you mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan turned around and his face seemed to gentle up when he saw her. Of course. They stood there together in a comfortable quiet for a little while, the night air feeling cool on their skin. The only sounds were the far-off howl of a coyote and the soft whinnying of the horses down in the barn. "I got a reply from Harold today," Elizabeth finally said. "He says he will come for me in about 2 weeks. Ethan nodded, his face looking strong in the moonlight. "That is good news." "Yes," she agreed, but her heart felt heavy as a stone. "I should be all healed up by then. And you will go on back to Denver, marry your banker, and live the life your father laid out for you." There was no judgment in his voice, just him stating a fact. Elizabeth looked down at her own hands, where the marks from the chains were already starting to fade. "It is what is expected. Is it what you want?" There was that question again, the one that seemed to look right into her soul. Elizabeth found she could not give him the polite answer that would have come so easy before. "I do not know what I want anymore," she admitted. Before I was taken, I just accepted my future without a second thought. It seemed like the sensible, safe thing to do. But now... Ethan nudged when she trailed off. Now, I am wondering if there might be more to living than just being sensible and safe." Elizabeth turned to look him square in the eye. "These past few days, watching you and Jesse with the horses, seeing the home Martha makes here, taking in the beauty and the freedom of this place, it has woken something up inside me I never even knew I had." Ethan's eyes stayed on hers, and Elizabeth felt like she forgot to breathe for a second at the fire she saw in them. "Freedom has a price," he said quietly. "It is about making your own way, making your own messes, and then taking responsibility for them. You choose what makes you happy. Is that what you were doing when you came out west?" A shadow fell across his features. "That was a part of it. I was also running from things after the war. I had some ghosts in Missouri I just could not seem to outrun." Without thinking, Elizabeth reached over, her hand covering his where it sat on the porch railing. His skin felt warm and calloused beneath her touch. "And did you manage to get away from them?" Ethan glanced down at their hands. Then his eyes met hers again. "A few of them followed me out here. But I found a kind of peace in this place that I could not find anywhere else. The very air between them felt thick and heavy, charged with an energy Elizabeth had no name for, but she could feel it in her bones. For one long moment she thought he was going to kiss her, and the bigger surprise was that she wanted him to. But instead he carefully pulled his hand out from under hers. "It is getting late. You ought to get some rest." A wave of disappointment hit her, but she understood he was doing the proper thing, so Elizabeth nodded. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Elizabeth." As she lay in her bed, sleep was nowhere to be found. Her mind kept replaying images of Ethan Keller, his steady strength, his gentle hands, and the way his eyes would crinkle up when he smiled. She had not even known him a full week. Yet he had somehow found a place in her heart that no one, not her father or anyone else, had ever come close to touching. Was this what love felt like? It was nothing like the calm, sensible arrangement she had with Harold. This was a wild, confusing storm of want and joy and fear, all tangled together. And if it truly was love, what on earth could she do about it? In less than 2 weeks, Harold was set to arrive and take her back to the life that had been chosen for her. A life that once seemed like a comfort, now felt like a prison sentence being handed down. The next morning came with a clear and brilliant sky, and a cool snap in the air that was the first hint of autumn. Elizabeth awoke. She was up before the sun, her mind too busy for sleep. She pulled on the borrowed clothes that were starting to feel like they belonged to her, and made her way down to the kitchen. It surprised her to find Ethan already in there, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He glanced up when she walked in, and the kindness in his eyes made her heart do a little flip. "You are up mighty early," he said, getting another cup down. He offered the coffee, and she nodded yes. She took the hot cup, and their fingers brushed for just a second. "I could not get to sleep." Ethan leaned on the counter, watching her over the top of his cup. Was it nightmares about the kidnapping? No, it was not that. Elizabeth paused for a moment, then figured the truth was best. "I was thinking about going back to Denver, back to Harold." "Are you having second thoughts?" "I do not reckon I ever had first thoughts," she confessed. "The whole engagement was my father's idea. I just agreed to it." Ethan put his cup down on the counter. "Elizabeth, whatever you choose to do, it has to be your decision. It cannot be your father's or Harold's or anyone else's, even if my choice disappoints everyone. Especially then." His voice was soft but solid. Life is too short to live it on someone else's terms. Elizabeth felt something give way inside her when he said that, like a rusty lock finally turning. But before she could say a word, Jesse came barreling into the kitchen, his young face full of excitement. "Mr. Keller, the black mare is dropping her foal, and I think something is wrong." Ethan was moving before the boy finished his sentence. "How long has she been at it? Her water broke about an hour ago, but she is pushing hard and nothing is happening. I will be right out." Ethan looked at Elizabeth. "I am sorry, I have got to go." "I understand," she said, telling him to go on. With a grateful nod, Ethan was out the door behind Jessie. He left Elizabeth all alone with her thoughts and a cup of coffee that was getting cold. A while later, after she had helped Martha with the breakfast dishes, Elizabeth walked out to the barn. Back in the city, she had never been around horses, but something about these animals pulled at her, and she wanted to understand them. The barn was cool and dark after the bright sun, and it smelled of sweet hay and horse. She followed the sound of voices to a big stall way at the back. Inside, Ethan and Jessie were on their knees next to a beautiful black mare. The horse was lying on her side, her body shaking with each push. "Is she going to be okay?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Both men looked up, surprised to see her there. Ethan had his sleeves rolled up, and his arms were covered in some kind of grease. "The foal is turned wrong," he told her. "I have to get it repositioned before she can give birth." Elizabeth stepped a little closer, curious now instead of scared. "Can I do anything to help?" Ethan looked at her for a long second, then gave a nod. "You can talk to her. Keep her calm." Horses listen to a kind voice. Elizabeth gathered her skirts and knelt down by the mare's head, reaching out a hesitant hand to stroke the animal's sweaty neck. "What is her name?" "Midnight," Jessie said. "She is the best cutting horse on this whole ranch." Elizabeth leaned in close to the horse's ear. "Hello, Midnight," she whispered. "You are doing a great job. Your baby will be here real soon." She kept talking in a low, soothing voice. All the while, Ethan worked with a quiet focus, his strong hands moving gently to guide the unborn foal into the right position. Elizabeth found herself watching his face, the deep concentration in his eyes, the firm set of his jaw, and the soft words he would murmur to the laboring horse. All of a sudden, the mare gave a powerful push, and Ethan sat back on his heels. "There. The head is in place now. She should be able to do the rest on her own." And just a few minutes later, the miracle happened right there in front of her. The foal came into the world in a single rush, its long legs all tucked in, looking dark and wet and absolutely perfect. "Colt," Ethan announced with a big grin. "And a handsome one, too." Midnight turned her head to look at her new baby, nickering softly. The colt, still slick and wet, tried to lift his head, already trying to get to his feet. "He is beautiful," Elizabeth said, completely lost in the moment. Ethan looked over at her, his face lit up with a smile she had never seen on him before. It was open and joyful, and it made him look like a boy. "Yes, he is." Their eyes met for a long moment, and something quiet passed between them. Jessie broke the silence with an excited whoop. "Just wait until folks in town hear about this one." "Midnight's colts always bring a good price," Ethan said with a chuckle, turning back to the new mother and her baby. "Let us give them a little time alone before we start counting our dollars, Jessie." They stayed there in the stall for another hour, watching as the wobbly little colt finally got his feet under him and, with a funny kind of determination, started looking for his first meal. Elizabeth was fascinated by the bond between the mare and her colt, the natural trust and love you could see in everything they did. By the time they left the barn, the sun was high overhead. Elizabeth looked down and saw her dress was stained with straw and dirt, and her hair had fallen out of its pins. Back in Boston, she would have been mortified to look so messy. But out here, it just felt right, like she had earned it. "Thank you for letting me be a part of that," she said to Ethan as they walked toward the house. "You were a real help," he answered. "Midnight took a liking to you. She can be mighty particular with strangers." "I have never really been around horses before," Elizabeth admitted. "In Boston, they were just for getting from one place to another. I never saw them as, well, individuals. Every single one has its own personality, its own spirit," Ethan said. "Just like people, once you take the time to know them." They reached the porch but stopped in the shady spot under the big oak tree. "I have been thinking," Elizabeth said, taking a deep breath, "about what you said this morning, about making my own choices." Ethan just waited, letting her find her words. "I do not think I want to marry Harold," she said quietly. "To be honest with myself, I never did, but I did not think I had any other choice. My father's will left everything in a trust until I got married, with Harold's father in charge of it. So if you do not marry him, you get nothing. Ethan's brow furrowed. Not until I turn 25, and that is 3 years from now. Elizabeth let out a sigh. My father thought he was protecting me from men who were only after my money. Instead, he made me dependent on the husband he picked for me. Ethan shook his head. Pardon me for speaking ill of your father, but that is a heavy burden to put on a person's future. He meant well, Elizabeth said, but her voice lacked real belief. He just wanted me to be taken care of. There are different ways of being taken care of, Ethan pointed out. Money in the bank does not mean much if you are miserable in your own house. His words hit her hard, right in the heart. No, she agreed softly. It is not worth anything. The sound of horse hooves made them both look up. A rider was coming up the trail, and it was clear it was not Jesse. Ethan immediately tensed up, his hand automatically going to his hip, where his gun usually sat, though he was not wearing it. Stay here, he told her, and he walked down the steps to meet the rider. Elizabeth watched, her heart pounding, as the man got closer. He was a stranger, a middle-aged man with a big mustache who looked like he had been riding for a good long while. Keller, the man called out as he pulled his horse to a stop. I have got news you need to hear. Ben, Ethan said in greeting. What brings you all the way out here? It is Silas Turner, the man said, his voice grim. Word is he has put a new gang together. He is looking for you, and for the lady you took from him. Elizabeth felt the color drain from her face. She could hear the outlaw's last words in her head, clear as day. This is not over. Ethan's face grew hard as stone. The sheriff caught one of Turner's new boys in town yesterday. The fellow was drunk and talking too much. Said Turner is planning something, and soon. I thought you ought to know. I appreciate the warning, Ben. You will stay for a bite to eat. The man shook his head. I have got to get back. The wife is expecting me. He tipped his hat toward Elizabeth. Ma'am. As Ben rode off, Ethan turned back to Elizabeth, his face serious. We need to go inside. Once they were in the kitchen, Ethan told Martha what was happening. She immediately started worrying about barring the doors and windows. I will send Jesse into town as soon as he gets back, Ethan said. We have to let the sheriff know Turner might be close. This is all my fault, Elizabeth said, her voice filled with panic. I have brought this danger to your family. No, Ethan said, his voice firm. This is Silas Turner's doing. It is not yours. You are not to blame for what he does. Elizabeth was not so sure. But if I had never come here, then you would probably be dead. Or worse, Martha cut in sharply. And that is quite enough of that kind of talk. What is done is done. Now, we get ready. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of activity. When Jesse got back, he was sent right back to town with a message for the sheriff. Martha took stock of all their food, while Ethan carefully checked and cleaned his guns, laying them out one by one on the kitchen table. Elizabeth was determined not to be useless, so she asked how she could help. Ethan paused for a moment, then he picked up a Winchester rifle that was leaning against the wall. Do you know how to use one of these? Shoot? Elizabeth shook her head. I have never so much as held a gun. Then it is high time you learned. He passed the rifle to her. If Turner and his crew decide to show up, I need you to be able to defend yourself. The weapon felt heavy and strange in her hands, both frightening and a little empowering. Ethan walked her through the steps, how to load a round, how to aim down the sight, and the single most important lesson. You never point it at anything you do not intend to destroy. We will practice tomorrow, he promised. For now, just get used to the weight of it in your hands. That night, no one in the ranch house slept well. Ethan insisted on standing the first watch, sitting on the porch with his shotgun laid across his lap. Elizabeth, too restless to sleep, joined him after midnight, a shawl wrapped around her against the chill. You should be sleeping, he said as she took a seat beside him. I cannot, she admitted. Every time I close my eyes, all I see is Silas Turner's face. Ethan's jaw tightened. I will not let him hurt you again. "It is not me I am worried about," Elizabeth said softly. "You and Martha and Jessie. All of you are in danger just because I am here." "We have been in worse trouble before," Ethan assured her, though the stiffness in his shoulders told a different story. They sat together in the quiet for a good while, the dark, endless night surrounding them. Finally, Elizabeth spoke up again. "If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp and fierce. "But if it does," she pushed on, "I want you to know that my time here at your ranch has been the most free and real I have ever felt. Even with all this trouble, I would not trade a single moment of it." Ethan turned to look at her, the starlight reflecting in his eyes. Elizabeth, whatever he was about to say, was cut short by the crack of a rifle in the distance, quickly followed by the drumming of horse hooves getting closer. "Inside now," Ethan ordered. He was already up and moving as they rushed into the house, Ethan slamming the door shut and dropping the heavy bar into place. Martha and Jessie were already awake, startled by the gunshot. "They are coming from the north," Ethan said as he checked his revolver. "Jessie, you take the back. Martha, get to the window upstairs. Elizabeth, you stay in the middle of the room, away from the windows." "I can help," Elizabeth protested, grabbing the rifle he had handed her earlier. Ethan looked at her for a second, then gave a sharp nod. "Keep low, and you only shoot if you absolutely have to." The next few minutes were a blur of tension and raw fear. More gunshots cracked through the night, much closer this time. Through the window, Elizabeth could make out dark figures sneaking toward the house in the blackness. "There are at least 6 of them," Jesse shouted from his spot. "Maybe more." "Hold your fire until they get closer," Ethan commanded. "Make every shot count." The attackers made it to the yard's edge, taking cover behind the water trough and a wagon. A voice yelled out. It was Silas. Said, "Keller, we know you are in there. Send out the girl and maybe we will let the rest of y'all live." "Go to hell, Turner," Ethan yelled right back. A whole mess of gunfire was the only answer he got, with bullets thudding into the wooden walls of the house. Ethan fired back through a skinny window and Elizabeth heard a man cry out in pain from outside. "Got one," Ethan grumbled, his voice hard as iron. The shooting went back and forth, bullets whizzing in both directions. Martha, who was staying surprisingly calm for a woman her age, fired the shotgun from an upstairs window, making 2 of the attackers fall back from the front door. Then, all of a sudden, it got real quiet, except for a little crackling sound. "Fire!" Jesse shouted from the back of the house. "They are trying to burn us out!" Elizabeth smelled the smoke before she saw it, a sharp, threatening smell that was creeping through the walls. Through the window, she could see flames starting to eat at the corner of the barn. "They are burning the barn," she cried out, thinking of midnight and her brand-new foal. Ethan's face was set like stone, full of anger and resolve. "Jesse, Martha, cover me. I am fixin' to get the horses out." "Ethan, no!" Elizabeth grabbed a hold of his arm. "It is too dangerous." His eyes locked with hers, and they were dead set. "I cannot just leave them in there to burn." Before she could say another word, he was gone, slipping out the back door and running for the burning barn, using the thick smoke to hide his movements. Elizabeth watched from the window, her heart pounding in her throat as Ethan vanished into that fiery building. Martha laid down a steady round of fire, keeping the attackers from getting a clean shot at Ethan. Jesse did the same from the back of the house. The minutes crawled by like hours. The flames leaped higher and higher, painting the night with a fearsome orange light. Elizabeth prayed like she had never prayed in her life, praying for Ethan's safety, for all of them. Then, like a miracle, horses started pouring out of the barn. First came Midnight and her little foal, then others, one by one, galloping away from the inferno into the safety of the dark fields. But where was Ethan? Just as despair started to take hold of Elizabeth, a figure stumbled out of the barn, coughing and black with soot, but alive. Ethan had made it out. The bastard made it. She heard one of the attackers shout, "Shoot him!" Without a second thought, Elizabeth raised her rifle and fired toward where the voice had come from. She had no idea if she hit anything, but her shot was enough to make the attackers duck down, giving Ethan the chance he needed to sprint back to the house. He burst through the door, gasping for air, his face streaked with grime. "All the horses are out," he managed to say between coughs. Elizabeth wanted to throw her arms around him in relief, but there was no time. The attack got worse, with bullets shattering windows and splintering the door frame. "They are trying to pin us down while the fire spreads to the house," Ethan said grimly. "We need to make a stand or we will be trapped in here." As if to prove his point, the smell of smoke grew much stronger. Through a broken window, Elizabeth could see the flames had now reached the corner of the house. "What do we do?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. Ethan's eyes met hers, and in that instant a silent understanding passed between them. It was a promise. If they were going to die here, they would die fighting together. "We make a break for it," he decided. "The wagon is still out back. If we can reach it, we might be able to get away." "What about the horses?" Jesse asked. "They will be scattered all over the range by now," Ethan replied. "We will have to leave them." The plan was desperate, but it was simple. Martha and Jesse would provide covering fire from the house while Ethan and Elizabeth ran for the wagon. Then Ethan would cover them while they followed. "Ready?" Ethan asked, his hand on the back door. Elizabeth nodded, her hands gripping her rifle tightly. "Ready? On three. 1, 2, 3. They burst out the door, running low and fast toward the wagon, which stood about 20 yards from the house. Gunfire erupted all around them, kicking up dirt at their feet. Elizabeth's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break out of her chest. They reached the wagon, and Ethan boosted her up onto the seat before scrambling up beside her. From the house, Martha and Jesse kept up a steady barrage of gunfire, keeping the attackers' heads down. "Now!" Ethan shouted to them. Martha and Jesse sprinted from the house, Jesse supporting the older woman as they ran. They had almost made it to the wagon when a shot rang out and Jesse stumbled, crying out in pain. "Jesse!" Martha screamed. Ethan leaped from the wagon, firing his revolver as he ran to help. Elizabeth, acting purely on instinct, stood up in the wagon and began firing her rifle toward the attackers, hoping to give Ethan the cover he needed. Ethan reached model, with bullets singing past their ears. Jesse and Martha struggled to get the wounded young man upright. The three of them stumbled toward the wagon, a storm of lead chasing them. With one last grunt of effort, Ethan shoved Jesse into the back, then gave Martha a hand up next to him. "Move it!" Ethan hollered to Elizabeth as he hauled himself onto the driver's seat. Elizabeth had never handled a team of horses in her life, but this was no time to learn slow. She snapped the reins hard across their backs, and the wagon shot forward, leaving the burning ranch house behind in the blackness. Silas Turner and his bunch kept firing, but the space between them widened with every second, and soon the shots fell short. Elizabeth pushed the horses into a dead run, sticking to the faint outline of the trail leading to town. Up on the seat, Ethan scanned the darkness for anyone following, his pistol at the ready. In the back, Martha was patching up Jesse's arm. The bullet had gone clean through the top, hurting like all get-out, but nothing that would kill him. "What in the world are we going to do now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice still trembling from the fear and the fight. "We're making for town," Ethan said, his tone as serious as a heart attack. "If Jesse's message made it, the sheriff ought to have a posse on the trail by now." He then cut a glance at her, his face lit up by the pale moonlight. "Then we're going to finish this mess for good." They pushed on through the night, the glow of their burning ranch shrinking behind them like some awful nightmare. Elizabeth's hands were rubbed raw from clutching the leather reins, and her shoulders screamed from the strain. Still, she kept the team moving towards safety, pulling strength from the steady man sitting beside her. Just as the sun started to paint the sky a soft gray, they topped a rise and saw the little town of Pine Creek laid out below. Ethan gently took the reins from Elizabeth's shaky hands and guided the worn-out horses down the main street toward the sheriff's office. News of their coming traveled faster than they did. By the time they pulled up to the sheriff's door, a small crowd was already forming. Folks were drawn by the sight of the refugees, covered in soot and smoke, and the hurt young man in the wagon bed. Sheriff Davis, a tall fellow with hair like steel and a face carved by the weather, stepped out of his office holding a rifle. "Keller," he said, "what in tarnation happened out there?" "Silas Turner and his boys," Ethan answered, helping Elizabeth down from the wagon. "They set fire to my ranch and did their best to kill us all." The sheriff's face went hard as rock. "Turner again. I've had a posse scouring the hills for him ever since Jesse showed up with your word yesterday. We've got to track him down before he does this to somebody else, Ethan said, his voice quiet but filled with a cold rage. And Jesse here needs a doctor. The town doctor was called for, and they carried Jesse over to his office to get patched up. Martha, dog-tired but unharmed, was taken in by the preacher's wife. That left Ethan and Elizabeth in the sheriff's office, laying out the whole story for the grim-faced lawman. "Turner's been a burr under my saddle for years," Sheriff Davis said after they were done. "But this here, burning out decent folks, snatching women, that's a line even he ain't crossed before." "Are you going after him?" Elizabeth asked him. "Already am," the sheriff promised her. "Got 6 men out as we speak, and I'm sending more. But it's big country out there, and Turner, he knows it like the back of his hand." "I'm joining that posse," Ethan said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. Sheriff Davis looked him over for a long second, then gave a slow nod. "Figured you would. We'll head out around noon. Gives the horses a rest and us time to get fresh supplies." "I'm going with you," Elizabeth announced. Both men whipped their heads around to stare at her. "Not a chance," Ethan said flatly. "It's way too dangerous." "I've already stared danger in the face," Elizabeth shot back. "This is my fight just as much as it is yours. Turner took me, chained me to his wagon like some animal. I've earned the right to see justice served." The sheriff coughed, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, while I admire your grit, a posse ain't no place for a lady," Elizabeth finished his sentence for him, her chin stuck out proud. "I just helped fight off a raid and drove a wagon all night to get us here. I can ride a horse, I can shoot a gun. Ethan taught me. And I know what Turner's face looks like better than half your men." Ethan's face was a mix of pride and deep worry. "Elizabeth, if something were to happen to you—" "It already did," she answered softly. "And I got through it thanks to you. Now, let me help you put an end to this." After a whole lot of back and forth, they finally settled on something. Elizabeth could ride with the posse to their main camp, but she'd have to stay put there with a few deputies while the rest of the men tracked Turner into the rougher country. As they were getting ready to leave, they got word that Harold Williamson had just ridden into town. He'd received Ethan's wire about Elizabeth's rescue. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop at the news. After everything she had just been through, her fiancé and the life she used to know felt like they belonged to a different person entirely. Harold was at the hotel wearing a path in the small lobby's floor when Elizabeth walked in. He looked just like she remembered. Tall and thin, with his brown hair combed just so, and glasses with thin wire frames. His suit was expensive and fit him perfectly, though it was a bit wrinkled from his travels. "Elizabeth," he cried out when he saw her. "Thank heavens you are safe. When I got the news of your kidnapping, I imagined the absolute worst." He started to pull her into a hug, but then stopped short as if he was just now truly seeing her. She was wearing borrowed men's clothes for practical reasons. Her face was still smudged with dirt and soot, and she had a rifle slung over her shoulder. "What on earth are you wearing?" he asked, and the relief in his voice was replaced by confusion. Elizabeth felt like she was watching the whole scene from far away. This man was supposed to be her husband, but she felt nothing for him at all. "Hello, Harold," she said, her voice low. "I am glad to see you're all right." "All right? I have been sick with worry, and now I find you dressed like some wild frontierswoman, carrying a firearm, no less." His voice was filled with real concern. "What has become of you?" Before Elizabeth had a chance to answer, Ethan walked into the hotel lobby. Harold turned and took in the sight of the tall cowboy in his trail-dusted clothes with a gun on his hip and a watchful look in his eyes. "Mr. Williamson," Ethan said with a nod. "I am Ethan Keller. I sent the telegram." Harold nodded back. "I suppose I owe you my thanks for rescuing my fiancée." "It was just the right thing to do," Ethan said simply. A heavy silence settled over them. The three of them stood there in a frozen picture that seemed to spell out the choice Elizabeth was facing: the safe, planned-out life with Harold, or the wild, dangerous, but real life she had tasted with Ethan. "Mr. Keller is riding with the posse to catch the men who took me," Elizabeth explained to Harold. "And I am going with them." "What?" Harold looked absolutely stunned. "That is utterly ridiculous. You are coming back to Denver with me, where you belong and where you will be safe." "I can't do that," Elizabeth said, and was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. "Not right now. Not until this is over." "Elizabeth, be sensible," Harold pleaded with her. "You have been through a horrible trauma. You are not thinking straight." "On the contrary," she argued, "I am thinking more clearly than I have in my entire life." She could tell that Harold truly was worried about her in his own way. But his worry was the kind a man has for a possession, based on what he expected of her, not on understanding the woman she really was or what she needed. "Posse's leaving in an hour," Ethan said, cutting through the thick air. "I'll wait for you outside. Give you two a moment alone." As he walked out, Elizabeth felt a pang of longing so sharp it nearly stole her breath. In that instant, she knew for certain where her heart had landed, even if her mind hadn't quite caught up yet. "Harold," she said softly, turning back to her fiancé, "I have to do this. After it is all done, we can talk about our future." Harold pushed his spectacles up his nose, his face a mask of confusion. "I do not understand any of this, Elizabeth. This is not the woman I know." "Maybe it is," she suggested. "Maybe this is the woman I was meant to be. But I just never got the chance to find out." In the end, Harold reluctantly agreed to stay in town until she got back. But you could see his disapproval in the stiff way he stood as he watched her ride out with the posse an hour later. The posse, 12 men in all, counting Ethan and the sheriff, left Pine Creek just after noon. Elizabeth rode a borrowed mare alongside Ethan, feeling the curious and sometimes judging stares from the other men. But the sheriff had spoken for her, and not one of them was brave enough to question his call. They picked up the trail heading north toward the rough country where Silas Turner was thought to be holed up. By the time night fell, they found a small, sheltered valley where the sheriff reckoned they should make camp. The plan was simple. Elizabeth would stay behind with a couple of deputies, and the rest of the posse would ride out at sunup. That night, as they all sat around the crackling campfire, her eyes kept drifting to Ethan on the other side of the flames. He was talking low with the sheriff, both of them hunched over a worn map of the area. The flickering firelight carved shadows on his face, making his jaw look stronger, and his eyes more set on his purpose. After the other men had turned in for the night, Ethan came over to where Elizabeth was sitting away from the others, just looking up at the endless scatter of stars overhead. "You ought to get some sleep," he said, taking a seat next to her on a fallen log. "I don't reckon I can," she told him. "The moment I shut my eyes, all I can see is the ranch burning. All I can hear are those guns." Ethan gave a slow nod. He understood. "Time helps. It does not erase it, but it dulls the edges enough so they stop jumping at you around every corner. Was it like that for you, after the war?" "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, "though it took a sight longer than I would have liked." Elizabeth pulled her knees up to her chin, wrapping her arms around them tight. "I am scared," she finally admitted. "Not of Turner and his men, but of what comes after. Of the choice I have to make." "Between Denver and Pine Creek," Ethan asked softly. "Between Harold and—" He let the rest of the question hang in the air. "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a long time before he spoke again. "Elizabeth, I have got nothing to offer you. My ranch is gone. Everything I spent the last 7 years building is just ashes now. You think that is what I care about?" "It ought to," he said, his voice serious. "You are used to a fine life, a safe one. I cannot give you that. Not right now. And maybe not ever." Elizabeth turned to look him square in the eye, the moonlight making her face shine like silver. "When they had me chained to that wagon, a safe life was all I could dream of. But I learned something out here. There are bigger things. Things like truth and freedom and having the courage to stand for something." She took a slow breath. Love. The word just hung there in the space between them, feeling both delicate and strong as iron. "Elizabeth," Ethan started to say, but she put her fingers on his lips to quiet him. "Do not you dare tell me what is good for me," she said. her voice soft but firm. For my whole life, someone else has been making my choices. My father, the people in Denver, even Harold. Just this once, I want to be the one who decides. Ethan took her hand, his rough fingers feeling warm against her own. So what is it you are choosing? Elizabeth's heart was hammering against her ribs as she leaned in close. This, she whispered, and then she touched her lips to his. The first touch was gentle, like a question. But then he pulled her in, his arms wrapping tight around her, and the kiss became something else entirely. A fire lit up inside her, a heat that had nothing to do with being afraid, and everything to do with the man holding her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. When they finally pulled away, they were both trying to catch their breath. Ethan rested his forehead on hers. "I've been wanting to do that from the first second I laid eyes on you," he confessed. "Even when I was covered in dirt and looked more dead than alive on that wagon," Elizabeth teased back. "Especially then," he confirmed, his voice gone husky. "There was a fire in your eyes. Nothing they did to you could put it out. They stayed there for a long while under all those stars and just talked. They spoke in quiet voices about where they had been, what they were scared of, and what they hoped might be ahead." When Elizabeth finally went to her bedroll, her heart felt lighter and more full than it had in a long, long time. The sun came up too fast, gray light just starting to paint the sky as the posse got ready to ride. Elizabeth stood a little ways off with Ethan, not wanting to say goodbye, even if it was just for a little while. "You be careful out there," she told him, her fingers nervously fixing the collar on his coat. "I always am," he answered with a little smile. "And you stick with Deputy Wilson and Hargrove. They are solid men. You will be safe with them until we get back." "How long do you think you will be?" "Hard to tell. If we find Turner's trail right away, no more than a couple of days." Elizabeth nodded, doing her best to hide how worried she was. "I will be waiting." Ethan took a quick look around to make sure nobody was watching too close, then leaned down and gave her a quick kiss. "That is a promise that will bring a man home," he murmured right against her lips. And then he was gone. He swung up onto his horse and rode out with the sheriff and the posse. And Elizabeth just stood there, watching them ride until they were nothing but specks on the horizon. Those next 2 days felt like an eternity to Elizabeth. She kept busy around the camp, cooking for herself and the deputies, and fought hard to keep her mind off all the terrible things that could happen out in that rough country, where Ethan and the others were hunting for Silas Turner. On the morning of the third day, as Elizabeth was down by the stream getting water, she heard the sound of a horse coming up the trail. Her heart jumped, hoping it was them. But it sank just as fast when she saw who was on the horse. It was not Ethan or the posse, but Harold Williamson. "Elizabeth!" Harold called out, hopping off his horse quicker than she would have ever expected. "Thank God I found you." "Harold?" she said, completely confused. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I have come to take you home, of course," he answered, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "This whole affair has gone on far too long." The deputies heard Harold's arrival and walked over, their hands hovering near their pistols. "Everything all right, Miss Prescott?" Deputy Wilson asked, giving Harold a hard look. "Yes, thank you," Elizabeth told him. "This is Mr. Williamson, my fiancé from Denver." Harold puffed out his chest a little, trying to look important, but it was clear the sight of those armed men made him nervous, not to show it. "I am here to escort Miss Prescott back to civilization, gentlemen. Her ordeal has ended." "With all due respect, sir," Wilson said flatly, "but the lady is in our care on the sheriff's own orders. She stays put until he is back." "That is ridiculous," Harold sputtered. "Elizabeth, get your belongings. We are leaving now." A flare of anger went through Elizabeth at his tone. "No, Harold. I already told you I'm staying right here until this is over. And I am telling you that this business of cowboys and guns has nothing to do with you." Harold's voice was getting louder with frustration. "This wild country has put a spell on you, with these rough men and their violent ways. These men are putting their lives on the line to stop a dangerous man," Elizabeth shot back. "A man who took me, who was going to sell me off like I was livestock if Mr. Keller had not stopped him. Ah, yes, you're brave cowboy, Harold sneered. The whole town is buzzing with stories about him. Tell me, Elizabeth, is he the reason? You are so dead set on staying in this godforsaken land? Before Elizabeth could even answer, the crack of a rifle shot rolled through the valley from far off. Everybody froze, listening hard as another shot followed, and then another. That is from up north, Deputy Hargrove said, his face grim. Right where the posse was headed. You two stay here, Wilson ordered Elizabeth and Harold. Hargrove, you are with me. Let's go see what that is. I am going with you, Elizabeth insisted, already walking to her horse. Elizabeth, Harold protested. This is absolute madness. But she was already swinging into the saddle, her heart hammering in her chest, terrified for Ethan. You can stay here if you want, Harold. I am going. The two deputies looked at each other, then gave a short, reluctant nod. All right. But you ride behind us, Wilson commanded. And the second things look bad, you turn around and ride straight back here. You understand me? Elizabeth nodded, not even hearing Harold still protesting behind her as the three of them rode off toward the sound of the gunfire, leaving him standing there all alone in the camp. They pushed their horses hard for a good 15 minutes, heading toward the sound of the fight, which got louder and louder as they got closer to a big mess of rocks. When they came around a sharp bend in the trail, they rode right into the middle of chaos. The posse was in a full-blown gunfight with Turner's gang, who were dug in up on a rocky ledge. Elizabeth's eyes darted everywhere, desperately searching for Ethan. Then she saw him, hunkered down behind a big rock, trading shots with someone she could not see up above. "Get down!" Deputy Wilson yelled as a bullet sang past their ears. They jumped off their horses and pulled them into the safety of some pine trees. The deputies ran to join the fight, adding 2 more rifles to the sheriff's side. Elizabeth, her heart lodged in her throat, ducked behind a fallen log to watch the battle. The sheriff's men were slowly making their way up the hill, pushing Turner's gang further back into the rocks. But the outlaws had the high ground and plenty of cover. All of a sudden, she saw something move off to her right. It was a man in a dusty black coat sneaking around the side of the fight. It was Silas Turner. No mistaking him. She could see that scarred face clear as day. He was lining up a shot, and his target was the sheriff, who was standing right out in the open, telling his men where to go. She did not even have to think. Her rifle was already at her shoulder. He was a long way off, maybe 100 yards, a hard shot for anybody. She heard Ethan's voice in her head. Breathe slow. Aim for a small target. Squeeze the trigger. Do not jerk it. She fired. The bullet went wide of Turner, but it slammed into the rock right next to his head. Little bits of stone sprayed into his face. He jerked back and dropped behind cover. His chance was gone. Her shot let the posse know where he was. The sheriff and a few of his men swung their rifles toward Turner, making the outlaw boss pull back. The whole fight got a lot louder after that. Lead was flying everywhere. Elizabeth ducked her head low, figuring she'd used up all her luck with that first warning shot, and didn't want to make herself a bigger target. Then she heard a voice she knew cry out in pain. It was Ethan. Peeking carefully around the edge of the tree, she saw him grabbing at his shoulder with blood oozing out between his fingers. He was pinned down good, with no way to get to better cover as bullets kicked up dust all around him. Without a second thought, Elizabeth started crawling her way toward him, staying as low as she could and using every rock and dip in the ground for cover. It was pure foolishness, and she knew it, but she couldn't just leave him there, hurt and out in the open. She was about halfway to where he was when a bullet sprayed dirt just inches from her cheek. She looked up and saw one of Turner's men taking a bead on her for a second shot. But before he could pull the trigger, another shot rang out, and a bullet hit him square in the chest. He tumbled backward and out of sight. Elizabeth turned to see who had just saved her skin and was floored to see Harold, of all people. Rifle in his hands, a hard, determined look set on his face. "Harold," she choked out. "Go on," he yelled over the noise. "I'll give you cover." Stunned but deeply grateful, Elizabeth kept scrambling toward Ethan, finally making it to the big rock he was using for shelter. "Elizabeth, what in the Sam Hill are you doing out here?" he asked, his face a ghostly white from pain and blood loss. "Saving you, it looks like," she shot back, ripping a long piece from her petticoat to tie up his bleeding shoulder. Can you even get up if I help you?" He winced. "Yeah, but we are pinned down good and proper." Elizabeth peeked around the side of the boulder to get the lay of the land. They were caught smack in the middle of a crossfire with no easy way out. But then she spotted it, a dry creek bed that snaked down from the rocks higher up, passing close to them before winding toward where the horses were tied. "There," she pointed. "If we can get to that gully, we might just have a chance to slip away." Ethan followed her gaze and gave a slow nod. "That's about 30 feet of wide-open space to get there. It's mighty risky." "I'll go first." "Draw their fire," Elizabeth declared. "Then you make a run for it." "No," Ethan said, grabbing her arm with his good hand. "That's too dangerous." "I'm smaller and faster," she insisted. "And you're hurt. It's the only way that makes sense." Before he could argue anymore, Elizabeth bolted from behind the boulder, running in a zigzag pattern toward the creek bed. Bullets kicked up dirt all around her, but not a single one hit its mark. She dove into the relative safety of the gully, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and terror. "Now!" she called out to Ethan. Wincing from the pain, Ethan threw himself out from behind the rock, running low to the ground toward the gully. More shots cracked through the air, but just like before, none of them found him. He practically fell into the ditch next to Elizabeth, gasping for air. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed," he panted. "I've been told I'm both," she answered with a wobbly smile. "Can you make it to the horses from here?" Moving together, they made their way down the dry creek bed, keeping their heads down to stay out of sight. The sound of the gunfight raged on behind them, but it got quieter with every passing minute. They were almost to the patch of trees where the horses were hidden when Elizabeth heard a man shout from up high. She looked back and saw one of Turner's men standing on a rocky ledge, his rifle aimed right at them. "Keller!" the man, Turner, roared. "You are a dead man!" Despite his injury, Ethan shoved Elizabeth behind him, using his own body as a shield. But before Turner could pull the trigger, another shot echoed, and the outlaw staggered, dropping his gun. He pitched forward and tumbled down the rocky incline, landing in a heap at the bottom without a twitch. Sheriff Davis showed up at the top of the ridge, smoke still curling from his rifle. "Got him!" he called down. "It's all over." The next few hours were a complete blur. When the rest of Turner's gang saw their leader fall, they gave up without much fuss. The wounded men, Ethan included, were patched up by the posse's doctor. 2 of the sheriff's deputies had been killed in the fight, and a few others were hurt. But Turner's crew had gotten the worst of it by far. Through it all, Elizabeth never left Ethan's side, refusing to move even when the doctor was stitching up his bullet wound. It was a clean shot, straight through the thick part of his shoulder, and had luckily missed any bones or main arteries. To her continued surprise, Harold also stayed close by, not saying much but just being there, watching her with a thoughtful expression as she cared for Ethan. As the posse got ready to head back to Pine Creek with their prisoners and their fallen men, Harold finally walked over to where Elizabeth sat beside Ethan's bedroll. "May I have a word with you?" he asked, his tone very formal. "In private." Elizabeth glanced over at Ethan, who gave her a slight nod. "Go on ahead, I'm not going anywhere." She followed Harold a little ways away from the main camp, wondering what on earth he could want to talk about. The Harold she had known back in Denver would have never chased her into a dangerous situation, and he certainly would not have picked up a rifle to defend her. "You saved my life back there," she told him once they were out of earshot. "Thank you." Harold took off his glasses and started cleaning them with his handkerchief, a nervous habit. "I honestly surprised myself," he confessed. "I have never in my life fired a gun at another person." "Neither had I until just recently." They stood there in a clumsy silence for a moment until Harold spoke up again. "You love him, don't you? That cowboy, Mr. Keller." Elizabeth didn't see any reason to deny it. "Yes, I do." Harold nodded his head slowly, like he was confirming something he already knew. "I could see it, watching you two together. You have never looked at me like that." "Harold, He held up a hand to stop her. Please, just let me finish. I came all this way west to get my fiancée, to bring her back to the life we had all planned out. But that woman is gone now, isn't she? Maybe she was never really there to begin with. Elizabeth felt a wave of sympathy for him. I'm so sorry, Harold. I truly never wanted to cause you any pain. I know, he said with a sigh. And to be perfectly honest, I think we probably would have made each other miserable after a while. I was looking for a proper society wife, a woman to host my dinner parties and look pretty on my arm. But you were meant for something much bigger than that. I can see that clearly now. Elizabeth was touched by his surprising understanding. What will you do now? I'll go back to Denver, back to my father's bank, Harold said. I'll get on with my life and maybe find a wife who actually desires the kind of life I can give her. He offered a small, sad smile. I do hope he makes you happy, Elizabeth. Thank you, she said quietly, feeling truly grateful for his grace. As Harold turned and walked back to the camp, Elizabeth stood there for a minute, just looking out at the huge open country all around her. So much had changed in such a short span of time. She had arrived out west as a sheltered young lady whose entire future had been planned by other people. And now here she stood, a different person entirely, stronger, braver, and at long last, free to pick her own trail. When she got back to Ethan's side, he was sitting up, watching her come toward him with those piercing blue eyes that had pulled her in from the very start. Everything okay? He asked, nodding his head toward Harold's departing figure. Yes, Elizabeth answered, sitting down next to him. It's better than okay, actually. Harold and I have reached an understanding. Oh? Ethan lifted an eyebrow. He is releasing me from our engagement, she told him. He could see that my heart was already somewhere else. Ethan's whole expression softened. And just where might that be? I think you know the answer to that, Elizabeth replied, taking his good hand in hers. With a certain rancher who pulled me out of a wagon and taught me what it really means to be alive. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, making his eyes shine with warmth. That rancher doesn't have a whole lot to offer you right now. His house is nothing but ashes, his horses are scattered, and his future is a big question mark. He has himself, Elizabeth said plainly, and that is all I want. With his good arm, Ethan gently pulled her closer, careful of his wound. Well, in that case, Elizabeth Prescott, once all this is settled and we are back in Pine Creek, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Not because anyone expects it or arranged it, but because we are choosing each other, freely and with all our hearts. Elizabeth felt like her heart could fly. Yes, she whispered, leaning forward to seal her promise with a kiss. 1,000 times, yes. 2 months after that, on a cool autumn day, Elizabeth Prescott became Elizabeth Keller. They had a simple service in Pine Creek's little church. Martha Winters and Jesse Cooper, his arm still in a sling but getting better, stood up for them as witnesses. The ranch was slowly being put back together. They had managed to find most of the horses, including Midnight and her growing colt. The folks in town, mighty impressed by the courage Ethan and Elizabeth had shown, had all pitched in to help. Selah Turner's whole crew had pitched in to help, showing up with lumber, strong arms, and housewarming gifts for the new husband and wife. After the wedding, Harold had headed back to Denver, seeming to have found some peace with Elizabeth's decision. As a parting gift, he had the trust her father set up completely dissolved. This gave her the kind of financial independence she never figured she would have before turning 25. It was a wedding present, he told her, to help them rebuild their home. That evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Ethan and Elizabeth stood on the porch of their half-finished house, just looking out across their land. Do you ever have second thoughts? Ethan asked, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. About giving up Denver and that high society life you were raised in? Elizabeth just leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace she had never known was possible. Not for a single moment. This right here is where I belong. It is where we belong, even with all the hardship, the danger, and not knowing what tomorrow brings. Maybe especially because of those things, she answered. They are what remind us we are truly living, not just passing the time. Ethan gently turned her to face him, the last light of the day reflected in his eyes. I never reckoned I would find happiness again after the war, he said quietly. I came west to escape my ghosts, to build something that was mine and mine alone. I sure never expected to find someone to share it with, someone who would understand both the dark and the light inside of me. And I never expected to find real freedom in the wilderness, Elizabeth replied, touching his face with a soft hand. Or to find courage in the face of danger, or love from a stranger who cut me free from my chains and carried me home. Ethan kissed her then, a kiss that held every promise of their future together. The ranch they would rebuild from the ground up, the family they would create, and the life they had chosen for themselves, freely and with open hearts. And as the night settled in around them, with stars popping out one by one across the vast western sky, Elizabeth knew that her true journey had only just begun. It was a journey of love and adventure, of tough times and joyful ones, right by the side of the man who had rescued her not just once, but twice. First, from the outlaws who had chained her up, and second, from the invisible bonds of a life that other people had chosen for her. In the years that followed, Elizabeth often thought back to that moment she first opened her eyes to see Ethan Keller riding toward her across the dusty flatlands. A moment that had felt like the end of one story, but was actually the beginning of a much greater one. Their life together was not always easy. The western frontier demanded grit and hard work from everyone who tried to tame it. But with every challenge they faced, from harsh winters and drought-filled summers to the birth of their children and the growth of their ranch, Elizabeth and Ethan always drew strength from the powerful bond they had forged in those first desperate days of danger and discovery. And on quiet evenings, when the children were all asleep and the day's work was finally done, they would sometimes sit together on the porch of their home, holding hands and just marvel at the incredible journey that had brought them together. A bride chained to a wagon, a cowboy with the courage to set her free, and the love that had given them both the greatest freedom a person can have, the freedom to be exactly who they were always meant to be, together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.